Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, it is time to take your questions, and we're going to start on the Patreon this week, and we've got two from Alan Herman. First one who asks, how is it that the business of government can continue to function if a budget hasn't been introduced yet into the new fiscal year? What is that mechanism that allows this? Where's the money being drawn from if it hasn't been allocated from the previous fiscal year? Okay, so two kind of things here. First of all, budget is a political document. The estimates are the actual financial instruments by which government operates. So the estimate cycle tends to work differently than the budget cycle. The Liberals did make a valiant attempt to align the budget and the estimate cycles back when Scott Bryson was Treasury Board President, and the public service fought him on that tooth and nail, and he lost. And so that's why they are still very divorced. Nevertheless, so normally the main estimates for the next fiscal year would be voted on before the end of March, and that was the plan, but then we had an election. And what happens in that particular situation is that the government is allowed to get what they are called special warrants. So it's an appropriation for a specific amount of money, and it goes to the Governor General who signs them. And that keeps enough money in the system going so that the government can continue to do its work, so that things like CPP checks will still go out and not bounce. Civil servants can get paid, so on and so on. This avoids the government shutdown aspect that happens in the US. And then once a new parliament is in place, one of the first things they will do is the estimates votes, as would normally happen on the estimate cycle. So when parliament does come back, probably late May, early June, estimates votes will be one of the first orders of business, so that those can actually be properly voted on, and appropriations can be made through to carry through the rest of the fiscal year, or at least until the supplementary estimates, at which time is when the estimate cycle and the budget cycle starts to reconcile itself. Again, Liberals did try to fix this. It didn't happen. And so that's why we're in that particular kind of cycle. Nevertheless, that is the mechanism, and that has been done. We saw a couple of Canada's specialist tech bros try and raise an alarm about the special warrant spending when they saw it, and thought it sounded ominous and scary and wrong, but no, that's how this system works, so that we don't have a shutdown like they do in the US. Second question from Alan is, I remember the early and mid-90s and the challenges we faced getting our deficit under control during the Chrétien first term or two, if memory serves. Even for all the years Canada had a surplus, all we managed to do was put a dent in our national debt. At this stage, with stimulus spending and COVID spending and tariffs, what's the magnitude of our national debt and deficit? How does it compare to the precarious financial situation we were in the early to mid 90s? What happens if the holders of our debt were to insist we pay up? So my understanding, and the last time I checked in with economists like Kevin Milligan, is that our debt situation is still very manageable. We are not sitting on the debt bomb that we were in the late 80s, early 90s, in part because we did have a lot of it did get paid down during the surplus years, mostly during Chrétien Martin, early Harper, but he started to spend through that pretty quickly on tax cuts. And the other thing to remember is that most of the deficits under the Liberal tenure, or under Trudeau's tenure, with the exclusion of the COVID spending, Most of that was all just basically a rounding error in terms of the size of our economy and total government spending. So the numbers look big, but our economy as a whole is over $1 trillion. What was accumulated during the Liberals spent during the Trudeau years was really not a lot, and measures like debt to GDP ratio were declining for the most part every year, which is the important measure because that's kind of, if your economy is still growing, then the amount of debt that you are servicing is shrinking as a result. And that's why that has been the fiscal anchor the Liberals have been mostly working toward, is constantly declining debt to GDP ratio, with the exception of the COVID years, because of course there was a lot of extraordinary spending that needed to happen, and it was their essentially decision that they would rather have the government spend that money because they had the fiscal room, rather than have Canadians basically trying to spend it, trying to finance their own way through that particular crisis period. We still don't know what's going to happen with the trade war right now, and how that's going to affect the debt or deficit situation. I mean, this is something that they're talking about somewhat during the election, and there's a few magical money tree promises going around in terms of what they think they can cut in order to finance other spending they want, particularly from the Conservative playbook. But we haven't seen any of those numbers yet because they have not released them, even though we are more than halfway through the campaign yet. And we're not in any particular kind of crisis situation with that. Like I said, debt to GDP ratio is still declining. It's something that, certainly governments need to keep a closer eye on. But we've had a few extraordinary years in terms of financial crises, one after the other. So that's kind of where we're at. In terms of what would happen if our debtors were to insist that we repay, that's generally not how these things tend to work, largely because bonds and debt and so on like that tends to be part of the basically lubrication for the economic engine. And so that kind of a scenario doesn't really happen. So I couldn't say with any particular certainty what would happen there, but it's just something that it's more of a theoretical, and maybe that's something I'll talk to an economist about in a future episode. So we'll stay tuned. Still on the Patreon, we have Keith Lovett, who asks, we're hearing a lot of tough on crime promises. Clearly some of Poilievre's stuff is unconstitutional. How about Carney's promise? So I took a second look over what the Liberals released this week on their plan, and most of it is it differs from the Conservatives, because the Conservatives are, again, it's the tough on crime approach. It's lock people up. It's the three strikes rule, which failed spectacularly in the States, by the way, and saw the homicide rate increase in jurisdictions where that was implemented. So probably not the best idea here. Regardless, most of the Liberal promises involve things like accelerating gun buyback, having the RCMP classify new models as they come in, stricter gun control enforcement, that kind of thing. So that's not going to trigger any particular constitutional issues. Hiring more RCMP, hiring more CVSA, hiring more Crown prosecutors, nothing unconstitutional in there. The one issue that may be an issue, or that may come up, is Make bail law stricter for violent and organized crime, home invasion, car theft, and human trafficking, including and especially repeat offenders. That's where they may have a problem. The law of bail is rooted in the presumption of innocence, and that's why bail is basically a charter right, and why the Supreme Court has been very careful about restricting people's liberties, because I mean that is the whole point about when you are convicted, is that your liberty is then restricted when you are incarcerated. It's not about punishment. So like the deprivation of liberty is the punishment. It's not about having hard times essentially within prisons. It's about the deprivation of liberty being the punishment, and therefore if you are depriving the liberty of people who have not yet been convicted, you need to have a very high bar for which to do that. And that's part of why people complain about the bail system. But again, that is the fundamental issue behind it. Our legal system is very much concerned more with avoiding wrongful convictions as opposed to avoiding wrongful acquittals, because again, it's about ensuring that you're not depriving the liberty of people who have not been convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's the question that we're seeing, because we don't have any specifics on what exactly it is that they're proposing to do with this toughening. So that could be the constitutional issue there. So we will have to see. And the other thing that I should mention though is part of the problem with bail as it is right now is lack of resources that the provinces are not putting toward the court system, because the provinces are the ones who do the administration of justice. So they're the ones who are supposed to be funding courtrooms and provincial judges who do a lot of criminal cases, justices of the peace. There's an issue in some provinces where you don't have justices of the peace who are properly legally trained. So therefore, they may not understand the law of bail very well and will grant it in cases where they probably may not, or they shouldn't. So that's another provincial issue. And also the issue of a lot of provincial detention facilities for pre-trial detention are overcrowded and in very poor shape. And that tends to lead to judges and justices of the peace trying to keep people out of those facilities. So they will be more lenient on bail in some of those cases because of the state of pretrial detention. And that's, again, another provincial issue that premiers are not being held to account properly for. So yeah, those are the issues with bail, that the federal government just simply tightening the criminal code is not necessarily going to actually fix anything with. They have other promises in here around intimate partner violence, hate crimes, non-consensual deep fakes, online exploitation of children, those kinds of things. Again, there's nothing really in there that would be a constitutional issue. So yeah, that's pretty much the difference between how the Liberals are approaching their crime policies as opposed to the Conservatives. And our last question today is coming from Bluesky, where Toon Dreshan asks, there's a renewed focus on Made in Canada solutions, pride in our built-in environment and cultural identity, as well as a push to renew social infrastructure. So will candidates consider and support development of a national built environment policy? And by that, he's also talking about national architecture policy, and he linked a couple of articles towards that. Toon is, of course, a great architect here in Ottawa. And the question, though, of whether parties will support that, I think is an open one. You would have to ask the parties. Yes, the fact that we are in a current moment of national pride, of a lot more made in Canada stuff, I think there's probably more openness to it. And for that to kind of be broached toward the next heritage minister, whether that remains Stephen Guilbeault or someone else. But you also run into this problem again where these kinds of architectural services and so on are generally within provincial jurisdiction. So you're going to have to, you would be running up against the issue where, much like a national building code, a national architecture policy, it would be something that would have to be voluntary, and something that would just kind of be like trying to set a stage for provinces to adopt. And we would have to see how much appetite there is at the federal level for something like that. We may be in a better place to see that right now, especially if, as part of trade war retaliation, we step back from, doing procurement processes with American firms or so on. So there may be an opening in there, but again, I'm not sure how much appetite there is, but that would be for people like Toon to make the case to the heritage minister once the dust settles from the election. So I wish I could say something more than that, but I think that's about all I can really say about it at this point. And that's Serving Food this week. Thanks for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDaleNo_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.